It resembles the joy of victory, which is so strong in some people that they do not even ask what they gain by such a victory. The peculiar way in which money ownership represents the extension of the personality and which is inherent in any possession, is supported and complemented by the following observation. Every sphere of objects that I imbue with my will is limited by laws inherent to the objects, by laws that my will is unable to break. Such a limit is set not only by the passive resistance of the object but also, from the other side, by the limitations on the capacity of the subject to expand. The range of objects that obey the will may be so large that the self is no more able to fulfill its task. If we say that possession equals freedom, if my freedom, that is, the predominance of my will increases with the quantity of my possessions, then this is really possible only up to a certain point, beyond which the self is unable to exert and enjoy its potential control over objects. Of course, greed may pass beyond this point, but it reveals its absurdity both in the lack of satisfaction that is part of its own fulfillment, and in the occasional constraint and restriction with which an excess of possessions turns into the opposite of their original character and goal. This leads to such phenomena as that of unprofitable property because the activity of the owner is insufficient to realize a return on it, the despot who becomes tired of ruling his slaves, because his will to power ceases at the unconditional surrender and the lack of resistance which would make him aware of himself, the property owner who has neither the time nor the strength for the enjoyment of his property because both are completely spent in the administration and nurture of that property. The objects differ only as to the question of what amount of the personality they can absorb at the same time, that is at what point possession becomes meaningless, because the self is able to control it only up to this point. Here, too, money occupies a special position. One might say that the administration, control and enjoyment of money requires less of the person than do other possessions, and that therefore the size of the possessions he may control and build up to an economic sphere of his personality is larger than it is for other forms of property. Apart from real enjoyment, the appetite for all other things is also, as a rule, limited by the receptivity of the subject, regardless of whether the limitations of both coincide and regardless of how far the distance between them may be. It is only money, as we stated in another context, that does not remain within the bounds that assert themselves as the limitations of the appetite for the object. Naturally, this is all the more the case, the more money is really nothing but money, that is a pure medium of exchange without any directly enjoyable value of its own. As long as cattle, food, slaves, etc., that is, consumer goods function as money, its ownership means lavish consumption rather than an expanding purchasing power. In other words, here are two different formulae for the extension of the personality alongside one another. In the case of primitive barter, it consists of the acquisition of objects by immediate consumption. One might say that the self extends continuously from the center, whereas in the case of abstract metal money, to say nothing of credit, these direct stages are of no consequence and are omitted. In contrast with the wealthy man in the barter economy, a rich person in modern society may lead the most modest and restricted life without any gratification in the direct sense. One can, for example, in the culinary sphere discover two tendencies that are a consequence of a developed money economy, namely that, apart from festivities, rich people tend to eat more simply, and that the middle class at least in the cities eats much better. Through the distant effects of money, the self may enjoy his power, his satisfaction and his will in relation to the remotest objects in as far as he neglects and passes over the more direct strata which wealth, in a less developed society, puts at his sole disposal. The ability of the individual to expand, which is limited by his own nature, exhibits a greater elasticity and freedom in relation to money than to any other possession. The difference between this and our earlier considerations is this. Earlier it was the specific character of objects that broke down the expansion of the self, whereas here it is the limitations in personal power that must diminish after a certain quantity of possessions has been reached, even with the complete elasticity of the objects. This is a phenomenon that is postponed if the possessions take the form not of specific objects but of money. Differentiation of person and possession. In the history of ideas we are confronted with a development which, despite its simple outline, belongs to the most significant forms of intellectual life by virtue of its comprehensive and penetrating realization. Certain areas are originally completely dominated by one characteristic trait. In the course of time, the unity is split into more and more subsections, one of which represents the character of the whole in a limited sense and contrasts with the other parts. Formulated differently, despite any relative contrast between two elements of a whole, both may nonetheless exhibit the character of one of them, though in an absolute form. For instance, the moral philosophical justification of egoism may be correct in claiming that we cannot possibly act other than in our personal interest and for personal satisfaction. But then one would have to differentiate between egoism in the narrower and in the broader sense. Whoever satisfies his egoism in the well-being of others, possibly by sacrificing his own life, we must undoubtedly continue to call an altruist and to distinguish from a person whose actions are detrimental and repressive towards others. Such a person would simply be an egotist, even though egoism in its absolute and broadest sense as reflected in any action may also be included in the former. Furthermore, the epistemological assertion that all cognition is a purely subjective process that is exclusively experienced and determined by the ego may be correct. Nonetheless, we distinguish such conceptions that are objectively true from those that are only subjectively true and are the result of fantasy, arbitrariness and deception of the senses, even though, taken absolutely, this more objective knowledge may also be of merely subjective origin. The trend is towards an increasingly basic and more conscious separation between objective and subjective conceptions which originally moved in a vague psychological state of indifference. This kind of progress seems to repeat itself in the relationship of man to his possessions. Generally speaking, every possession is an extension of the self, a phenomenon within subjective life, and its whole meaning lies in the conscious and emotional reflexes that are the mind's response to the self's relations to objects. In the same sense, everything that happens to possessions is a function of the subject who imposes his will, his emotions, his way of thinking upon them and finds his expression in them. However, historically, this absolute importance of practical as well as intellectual possessions is first embedded in a state of indifference which, located beyond the opposition of the self and the objects, unites them both. The ancient Germanic constitution which tied property directly to the person, the later feudalism which, conversely, tied the person to the property, the close connection with the group as a whole which allows its members a priori to grow into their economic positions, the hereditary character of occupations by means of which activity and position on the one hand, and the familial person on the other, became interchangeable terms. Every organization of society based on estates and guilds that is conditioned by an organic interplay of the person with his economic position. All these are instances of the lack of differentiation between property and person. Their economic contents or functions and those that represent the self in a more limited sense are very closely and mutually dependent. Such a relationship is observable in the ancient custom of allowing the personal belongings to go with the dead into their grave. It was present too, while this custom existed, when the Anglo-Saxon king had a claim to his vassal's armor when he died, since it was due to the king as a vestige and substitute for the person bound to him. Generally speaking, just as the thought of primitive peoples has no separate categories for distinguishing merely subjective imaginings and the objectively true conception, so it is unable to distinguish clearly in practice between the particular lawfulness of things. Wherever this is recognized, it readily appears as the personified form of a divine principle, and the self-centered personality that is independent of external factors. The development beyond this stage lies in the separation of these elements. All more advanced economic technology rests upon an increasing independence of economic processes. These processes become detached from the immediacy of personal interests, they function as if they were ends in themselves, their mechanical process becomes less and less disturbed by the irregularities and unpredictability of the personal element. On the other hand, the personal element becomes more and more independent, the individual becomes capable of developing more independently, not of his economic situation as a whole, but of the a priori factors that determine it.